Welcome to Rock City Cookies, where we talk about all things cookies. If you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon to be notified when we upload a new video. Thanks for watching. Hey sweet friends, we are going to do a new set today of Christmas cookies that were actually submitted for my application with the Christmas Cookie Challenge on Food Network. While you will not see my smiling face on TV this year, I did make it through a few rounds of the auditions. I'll be sharing some of the other creations for my audition here on YouTube in the coming weeks, and the entire story of my journey with the Food Network this year will be on my Patreon page. But for now, let's get going on the tutorial of how I made this Scandinavian-inspired Christmas cookie set. The first cookie that we will be decorating today is my version of an alpine Christmas tree. Using a thick royal icing that I have colored with a tiny bit of brown food coloring to make it turn more tan than brown, I piped one line of icing down the center of the cookie, and off of that, I'm piping the branches following the lines of the Christmas tree. Now, these lines are mostly to be used as a guideline when doing your tree needles because you won't really be able to see a lot of the brown by the time we're done. As I've mentioned in the past, if I'm doing a very repetitive action, I like to put multiple cookies on my turntable and work them at one time, because we all know custom cookies take a lot of time. So if you can do anything like putting a grouping of cookies together at one time and do the same step on all of them at the same time, that really does help to speed up your process. So for this first batch of needles, I'm just wanting to lay the foundation for the base of my tree. So I'm starting my green icing, which again is a thick icing. I do not want these needles to touch and blend together. So even if I do touch the needles together, I want them to keep their shape. So it's a pretty thick icing. This icing would have been straight from my batch of icing that I make, and then I would have added a little bit of extra powdered sugar to thicken it up just a little bit more. In addition to my thick icing, I did cut a small hole in my piping bag as well. If you use tips, I do recommend that you use a small piping tip like a PME 0 or a PME 1 tip, which I will link in the description box below. Otherwise, start with a very small cut on your piping bag, and then you can always cut a little bit more if you need to, but I would start small and work your way up. So for this base layer of our alpine tree, I am starting my icing at the trunk of the tree and then following the shape of our Christmas tree cookie cutter, I am pulling the icing from the trunk of the tree up kind of at a diagonal to the edge of the cookie. The trick to getting these cookies to look beautiful and detailed is going to be a lot of layering. So we're going to finish up this first base layer, and then we're going to go right back to that first tree we worked on and put a layer of pine needles in between what we've already done. By waiting just a minute before starting your second layer of pine needles, you allow your icing to crust over just enough so that when you come back with that second layer, that all of the needles are still defined and really add that extra wow touch. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, because of the thick icing and all of the itty bitty lines, this cookie design is definitely one that will hurt your hand. And in fact, in this video, you will see me release the bag often and readjust my grip just because it does hurt after a little while. So you might have to do that a few times as you're doing this cookie. One other thing that I do want to mention is that whenever you have a small hole in your piping bag and you have a thick icing, you may have some curling happen with your icing. That just means that when you're squeezing the icing out of your bag at the end where the icing is coming out, instead of laying flat on your cookie, it might curl up back onto the bag instead of going onto your cookie in a straight line. If you watch closely, you'll actually see it happen here. I've had to take my bag away, and with a wet paper towel, I will wipe off the tip of my bag and then continue on working. So it happens to the best of us. It's just thick icing trying to come out of a really thin little small opening. So don't worry if you do have curling. You can either cut a little bit of a bigger hole, which will help, or you can do what I do and just when it happens, take your bag away, wipe it off with a wet paper towel, and then you're able to continue piping piping, and hopefully it doesn't happen too often that it's too much of a nuisance. Now that we have a good base of our alpine tree, it's time to add some pine needle branches. Once again, we're going to be using the brown icing that we did in the very first step of this cookie as the starting point for our needles. Only this time we will start with our icing at the branch itself and then pull away. As we get closer to the center of the tree, our needles will get longer and they will stay shorter as you get to the edge of the cookie. You're also going to want to do these in the opposite direction of your original pine needles so that you have this really cool layering effect. Are you starting to see my vision? And again, we're going to put down one layer to begin, and then we will go back and fill up those branches with even more pine needles so that they really look nice and full. While I do make most of my tutorial videos at real time decorating, with this cookie I am speeding up a lot. And really that's just for your benefit, because I do believe that this one cookie took me about 15 minutes total. So I don't think you want to sit here and watch me decorate one cookie for 15 minutes. So I do speed up the video in editing just so that we can move on to our other designs. But if you have any questions, let me know. But all you need to know is just layer, layer, layer. So let each layer dry just a few minutes in between, and then really build up those leaves until you're satisfied with how they look. Now that our branches are done, let's take a closer look at this cookie so that you can really see all the different layering and the dimension that it gave to this cookie. Time consuming? Yes. Worth it? Absolutely. Keeping with the Scandinavian inspiration, I wanted to kind of do a very natural set. So we're not going to add a ton of decorations to our trees. We're just going to add a little bit of groupings of red cranberries here and there throughout the tree. As with all of our icing so far in this set, this is also a thicker icing so that whenever you are piping these little red dots of cranberries right next to each other, that they don't lose their shape and blend into each other at all, that you will still be able to see exactly how many are in each grouping. I did try to make sure that every branch had at least one cranberry on it, as well as one kind of at the base of the tree and the top of the tree. I personally like the look of sugared cranberries, so I did want to put sugar on all of my cranberries throughout the entire set for cohesiveness. So I'm just using regular old granulated sugar to do this. Now I do like to have a empty sprinkle container that I fill with the granulated sugar just to keep things easy. I can pull that out at any point in time. And then I also have a sprinkle catcher underneath to catch any of the extra sugar so that I can reuse that. I will link the sprinkle catcher tray in the description box below because I love it and I use it all the time. Turn the cookie upside down, give it a good shake to get all of the extra sugar off of your cookie. And you can even use a dry paintbrush to come back and brush off the extra sugar as well. Okay, our first design is done. Let's move on to design number 2. Our next design is going to be on a leaf cookie cutter. Now this cookie cutter is one of our cookie cutters. It will be linked in the description box below, but you can also find it on Etsy. But instead of leaves, we're actually going to make cranberry branches. Now for the background, this is the very first time I ever attempted to do a crackle background. And as is the case with so much in the cookie world, it definitely had a learning curve. And as you can see here, I wasn't as successful as I was hoping to be. However, I did learn a few things. So let me teach you what I learned so that if you try this technique for yourself, you'll be ahead of the game. To get a crackle effect, you will need to take white food coloring and paint it onto your raw, unbaked cookie. Now, the trick here that I hadn't learned at the point of doing these cookies is that 1, you need to have a flat brush that you're using. 2, it has to be AmeriColor white food gel coloring. I don't know why other brands don't work, but that is the best one to get this effect. Next, with your paintbrush, you will need to paint in the same direction all the way across your raw cookie. And as you're painting all in the same direction, the same way across your cookie, it doesn't matter which direction you go in, just make sure you try to stay in one direction. You need to put a pretty decently thick amount on. So where I went wrong with these leaf cookies and trying to get that crackle background is I went back and forth, which allowed the white food coloring to to get too deeply into the dough, and I did not use a thick enough amount. So my layer was too thin, which just did not allow it to get that good crackle effect. And finally, I used a very small angled brush, and because of that, I was having to push more of that white food coloring a little bit too hard into my dough. So I really think that if you use a flat brush, you will get more of the surface of your cookie covered faster without having to push too deeply into your dough, and it also helps to get the right amount of thickness on your cookie as well. The good news is that even though it didn't turn out exactly how I wanted it to, I still like the distressed look it gave. Plus, I think the white background with these cranberry branches is a really nice touch. It's a good contrast. So even though it wasn't exactly what I wanted, I think it still worked out in my favor to go ahead and attempt this technique. Now, I do get better at it later on in the set, but for now, I think it worked for these cookies, although it wasn't exactly what I intended. Now that I talked about the background of this cookie the entire time you saw me decorating it, it was a pretty simple, straightforward design. I was able to just do the thin branches, and then I added my cranberries on top, and then of course now I sprinkled with the granulated sugar just as I did on the very first cookie. And now with a dry brush, I am just kind of brushing off any of the extra sugar. You have to be really careful not to accidentally touch your cranberries, since your cranberries are still wet icing. So you may find that in your process it's better to wait until your cookie has dried a little bit, just so that you don't accidentally mess up any of your hard work. So again, that Scandinavian inspiration means that nothing is really kind of over the top. It's kind of simple, and so that's why I chose to do this very simple cranberry branch, which I think will tie in nicely with the other designs. Speaking of cranberries, our next design is going to be a more concentrated bunch of cranberries on a holly cookie cutter. In the past, when I have used this cookie cutter, I had the entire bottom just be one red circle. However, I wanted to have this look more like cranberries and a little bit less like holly. So I wanted to make sure and do a grouping of cranberries to kind of pay homage to where I've had cranberries throughout the rest of the set. I'm also going to change up the leaves a little bit on this cookie cutter. So holly leaves tend to have the really pointy leaves, and instead I'm going to use the same technique that I did on the first cookie and make those alpine evergreen needles instead. 2 cookies comfortably fit on my turntable, so that's how many I'm going to do at one time. Also, by working on 2 cookies at one time, by the time that I get all of the base layer of the needles put down, the icing will have dried enough that I can go right away with the second layer. All right, so let's move on to just that. Let's go ahead and do the second layer. Now go real slow with this layer and make sure that you're going in between the gaps that you left with the first layer. Have you ever wondered where the tradition of stringing cranberries together and placing them on your tree came from? Well, truthfully, it came from a time where things were a lot more modest than they are today. Christmas decorations were made from those things that could be found around your home, such as evergreen trees, which could be made into wreaths and garlands. Mistletoe and hollies were typically readily available, and people could decorate their homes with those as well. And cranberries were harvested between September and December, which meant that a lot of families had cranberries on hand from the fall harvest. And a common household item was definitely needle and thread. So it just became common occurrence for people to just thread their cranberries together and decorate their homes with it. And so I love taking the time to remember that a lot of our modern traditions come from a more modest time. All right, I did go back and add a third layer of needles onto my leaves, and now I'm just going to add my groupings of cranberry with my thick red icing. Thankfully, I do not film this way anymore because all you can see here is my hand in the way. But if you look at the cranberries to see what kind of consistency I'm talking about, you can see each individual cranberry, even though they're touching, even though it's wet icing, it is thick enough that it holds its shape. It doesn't blend into the cranberry next to it. Add your sugar on top, shake off the excess. With your dry paintbrush later, go in and get any of that little bit of extra sugar that didn't shake off. And don't worry, that sugar does seep into your icing a little bit. It's not so in your face, hey, there's sugar on my cookie, once the icing has dried. As you can see here, it looks much more subdued in the final picture. All right, moving on to our next design. We are going to make a second Christmas tree cookie using the exact same cookie cutter that we used before, only this time we're going to do a totally different technique. With the same green that we have used for all of the Alpine Evergreen needles, we are going to use a more thinned out version and flood this tree. Now, whenever I am doing a color multiple times over a set with all different consistencies, I start with a big bowl of icing. I will get the icing the color that I want it. No matter what consistency it is, I want it to all be the same color. So I will get it the color right first. And the consistency that I typically work with originally in the bowl that's the really thick icing, I like for that consistency to be what I used here to outline the edge of my cookie. So that's great for writing, it's great for outlining. It's just that perfectly stiff but not too stiff icing. That is what I start all of my colors at. All of my consistencies start there. It's pretty much the exact consistency that I get with a fresh batch of icing straight from the mixer. I will then have a piping bag ready to go, and I will scoop out whatever icing I need for that consistency and go ahead and put that in one piping bag. I will then take out another scoop of icing and put it into a smaller bowl for any icing that needs to be thickened up. So that's my really thick icing like I'm using for the pine needles. So once I have that in a different bowl, I will then spoon in 1 teaspoon at a time powdered sugar until I get it thick enough that I'm happy with the consistency, and then I'll put that icing into a piping bag as well. Now, to distinguish between the two consistencies, I use rubber bands to tie off the outline/writing consistency icing. I'll do those with a rubber band. That way, since I have two bags that look pretty much exactly the same, I'll be able to say, oh, I know this one's a rubber band, this is my outline or writing consistency, and the one tied off, I can immediately see from looking at it that that is my really thick consistency. Okay, and with the icing that is left in the big bowl, I then use a spray bottle and I spray my icing with warm water and I thin it down to my flood consistency. I'll then place that icing into a bag. Usually that's a bigger bag, so it's pretty easy for me to see which one's my flood consistency, but I also use bag clips on those instead of rubber bands or tying them off. So even then I can tell by looking at it, oh, that one has a bag clip instead of a rubber band or tying it in a knot. So I know that one is my flood consistency. And if you are a visual learner and you have no idea what I just said, don't worry, I will have my icing consistency video coming out in January. Okay, so I did outline my cookie, I flooded my cookie, I let that dry completely, and then I went back and added my tree trunk. And now we're gonna add a fun palette knife technique on top of our tree. So using a thick consistency icing, you are going to want to make a dot of icing across your cookie. And with a palette knife, I will link the ones that I have in the description box below. They're pretty inexpensive. You will push the tip of your palette knife into your icing and then lightly drag your icing down. This is a very easy technique to get the hang of, and honestly, I think it adds a lot to a cookie. It makes it look really fun and cool, and I definitely recommend trying this technique if you have not done so before. I have also used this when I have made mermaid tails, and that looks really fun as well. So as you work your way from the base of the tree to the top of the tree, you will have less dots that go across, and hopefully you will end up with one final dot at the top of your tree. Now, to give our tree just one last little touch of something extra special, I did add some sprinkles on top. Now, I did get these particular sprinkles at Walmart, and I'll be sure to link them in the description box below, but I'm sure that you can find very similar sprinkles at any sprinkle shop. Just make sure you use some sort of tray to catch those extra sprinkles so that you don't waste any and you're able to put them right back into your sprinkle container for the next cookie. Okay, now that we have added that last touch to our cookies to make them nice and sparkly, we are done with this design. Let's move on to our next cookie. And just as we repeated the Christmas tree cookie cutter, only using 2 separate designs, we are going to do the same thing with our leaf cookie cutter. The first time we made a cranberry branch, and this time we are going to make an evergreen leaf branch. Instead of having a bare cookie again, I did want to make sure that this cookie had a base layer of royal icing on it. I think the cookies that are natural and bare are beautiful. However, there are a couple of drawbacks to them. Adding a layer of royal icing over the entire surface of your cookie adds a level of protection to them. It keeps your cookies from drying out. It really does make your cookie last a lot longer. For some reason, I can't explain it. I don't know why, but it does protect your cookie in that way where it preserves it for longer. And secondly, some people do prefer a sweeter cookie, and you aren't going to get that punch of sweetness that you get with your royal icing on a pretty much naked cookie. So that's the second reason why I like to make sure if I have some bare cookies that don't really have much royal icing on them, that I always include cookies that have plenty of royal icing on them as well, so that you can satisfy all the different types of clients that you'll get. Now, my icing is a little bit on the thicker side, so I am going to have to use my scribe to kind of smooth out and levelize my icing. I usually also accomplish this by picking up my cookie and shaking it a little bit or tapping it on my table. And I'm always looking for those pesky air bubbles. So as I smooth out my icing, I'm also looking to pop any air bubbles that I see. Now that our base is dry, we are going to add our stem for our evergreen leaf onto our cookie by following the natural curves that are already there from the cookie cutter. Now, this stem will mostly be covered up by our evergreen needles in just a second. However, this does give you a guide of knowing where to start and where to stop your needles. And just like all of the other times that we have done this piping work throughout this set, do remember that you will need to leave space in between your lines so that you can come back and layer. And we will work with the background first. So that means that we are going to want to do all the way down the middle of the cookie first, just like we did with our Christmas tree. And then we will work on the side leaves second. So that will be what's up front. So just remember, when you're thinking about how you want your cookie to look, you always think about the background first. So what do I want to be in the back? Make sure you pipe that first. Then after you've established that, then you pipe your details that you want to be in front last, so that you're always working in layers and thinking about that 3D look to your cookie. While I'm working on my lines, I do want to give you a helpful tip in case you have cut the opening of your piping bag too big. So this happens to me more than I care to admit, but I will just get careless. I won't pay close enough attention, or I just miscalculate how big I need the opening of my bag to be. When that happens, you have one of two options. Either deal with it and hope for the best, which is pretty much not the greatest option, because most of the time you need a small hole for a reason, and if it's too large, it can really mess up your design. Or two, rebag your icing. Now, I'm lazy and I hate rebagging my icing. In fact, I hate it so much that sometimes I just suffer through the wrong size of a hole because I hate to rebag my icing. So I have found a better solution. I will take my existing bag of icing and I will purposely cut the hole even larger than it was already. Slide that bag of icing into a brand new piping bag, and then tie a clip around both bags. So basically, you have a double bagged bag of icing. This will save you from the mess of having to scoop out all of your icing or squeeze out all of your icing in your existing piping bag into another bag. This way, it's super fast. You just cut a larger hole, you stick the new bag over the old bag, tie it off, and you're ready to go. So you can actually see that I did that very thing with this bag. So if you look carefully at my piping bag that I'm using, you can see the bottom 2 inches of the bag has a darker area than the rest of the bag. It almost looks wet, but it's not. It is just this bag within a bag technique that I do when I make a mistake when I go to cut my hole into my bag. Thankfully, I was much happier the second time around, so I was able to salvage this icing without having to completely unbag it and put it in a new bag, and I got to avoid all the mess that comes with that. So if you were wondering why my icing bag has looked so weird this set, now you know. Our leaves are done, but we definitely don't want to leave the cookie plain as it is, so let's add a little bit of a splash of red with our cranberries. I didn't want to add cranberries all over the leaves as I've done in some of the other designs in this set, so instead I'm just going to do a grouping of 3 right at the base of our leaf. And just like with all of our other cranberries, we are going to sugar these as well. So grab that tray and then just sprinkle your white granulated sugar over the cranberries. Shake it off. And remember, after it dries, you can always go back with a dry paintbrush and get out any extra sugar that has made its way into any areas. Or if you're a risk taker like me, you'll just go ahead and do it even though the icing is still wet. And most likely you'll regret it because you will accidentally touch the cranberries with your paintbrush, which happened on more than one occasion. All right, now that our evergreen Christmas tree leaf is done, we have one final design in this set. It was probably my favorite design. I would even say it was a joy to make. I started this design with the crackle background that I did earlier in this set, and as you can see, I got better at it with this cookie than I did with the cranberry branch cookie from earlier, which is good because this is supposed to look like a distressed wood board. So I'm glad that it worked better on this cookie, and because it worked, we're just going to frame out the cookies so it looks again like a wood board. So I'm just using that same tan that I've used elsewhere as my stems and using that for the wood frame on this rectangle cookie. Now I found this joy image that I'm projecting onto my cookie here on Google Images. So you can just probably search for joy clip art and I'm sure it'll pull up somewhere in the search results. But the inspiration for this design is from Kristen's Cookies. And y'all, if you do not follow Kristen on Instagram at Kristen's Cookies, you are missing out. She is an amazing human being. She is so encouraging, but her designs are out of this world. Like, she is a level of skill that I can only dream of becoming one day. Like, I seriously love every single thing that she does, and it is icing on the cake that she is the nicest human in the world. So definitely go follow Kristen's Cookies. If you do not, you will not be disappointed. She's phenomenal. So taking the inspiration of her design where she made a joy cookie with a kind of distressed background, I wanted to do the same here by outlining the J and the Y with red so that I tie in the red cranberries, as well as making the O a wreath, which will match my evergreen leaves all the way throughout this set. But you definitely want to make sure that you do the JOY first before you start piping the details onto your wreath. Because just as I mentioned earlier, you want to always do the background piping work first. And so that's going to be your J and your Y. That's going to be your background. And then you want your wreath to kind of sit on top of that so it looks three-dimensional. Because the truth is, if this was a real sign, if this was something really hanging in someone's home, the wreath would pop out in front of the letters. Just as before, you're going to want to do the first layer with spaces in between, then go back and fill in the second layer, and then you might even have to go back with a third layer in a few places to really build up that wreath. All right, let's add our cranberries for this final touch to this last cookie. So just add some random groupings throughout. You can have groupings of 3, groupings of 2, 1 all by itself. There's really no rhyme or reason here. Just make sure that your wreath looks a little bit balanced and that you have cranberries all the way around your wreath. Once you are satisfied with your cranberries, it is time to add the sugar to them, and then our final cookie is done. What do you think? Was this a good enough set to submit to the Christmas Cookie Challenge? Would you have done something totally different? Would you have gone a more traditional Christmas route? I'm curious to hear if you even attempted to get on the Christmas Cookie Challenge. So I would love to hear your stories below. Thank you so much for watching. I've got a few more videos coming out before Christmas, but in case you don't catch any of those, happy holidays, and I hope that it is a fantastic season for you and yours.